I hated this computer when I was a kid. Can I learn to love it now? My name is Jesby, this is my tech department. Los kids. The BBC Micro is one of those machines that is a near legend in its own lifetime. After the UK government had a rare bit of foresight, realising that computers would be important in the future, they planned to get every school child in the UK up to speed ready for the coming micro revolution. The BBC were tasked with producing educational shows to train us on how to use these new machines, and they're also tasked with providing the machine for us to use. Now, after a somewhat bitter battle between Sinclair and Acorn, and if you want to know more about that, I suggest you track down a drama called Micromen. Deals with this exact story. Fantastic. However, after this battle, Acorn was victorious and was given the contract by the BBC to produce the BBC Micro. Now, by the mid-1980s, these machines were in every school from primary age up. The Model B, which is the model I have here, I think, featured a full-size keyboard, 32 kilobit of RAM, and a 6502 processor running at 2 MHz. Around the back there are both RF composite and RGB output ports, which gives you a real good choice actually of displays to connect the BBC up to. There was a serial port, cassette port and analog port, plus something called EcoNet. Now this is a basic local network support which is perfect for schools' environments, no doubt. Of course the BBC isn't finished yet, as if you flip the machine upside down, there are further ports for a disk drive, a printer, a user port, a 1 MHz bus port for peripherals that can't run at 2 MHz, and the tube. The interesting and mysterious tube port is actually something really fantastic for a machine of this age. It essentially allows the BBC to, well, talk to another processor or coprocessor. I mean, that was pretty unheard of for 1982, and especially in a machine aimed at the home market. With the BBC filling schools with their new machine, they also released it to the public, with the idea that if the kids are using it in school, they can also do their homework at home on the same machine. Priced at £235 for the Model A and £335 for the Model B, they weren't cheap, and that's around £800 to £1,100 today respectively. Unsurprisingly, sales were slow, especially when you consider that the £99 ZX Spectrum was, well, cornering the market essentially. The BBC stood no chance. Still, the BBC is a friendly face to anyone who was in school in the 1980s, myself included. Now, feeling kind of cocky when I got the BBC, I did something you should probably never do with vintage electronics. I plugged it in and switched it on. And surprisingly, the machine actually sprang to life. But then, I was testing the BBC, and oops. Yes, I'd released the dreaded magic smoke. And that's not surprising. The reefer caps in these power supplies are known to fail, and I should have known better. But you know what? Curiosity got the better of me, and I tried it. More fool me. Of course, it does now leave me with the first problem to fix. Let's take the machine apart and fix that power supply. Getting the BBC apart is actually fairly simple. All you need is a screwdriver and yeah, that's it. There are 2 screws at the back and a further 2 screws underneath the board. Remove those and the top will literally just lift off. It couldn't be simpler. To get a power supply out, there are 3 screws underneath it. Just again, remove the screws, and that will mean that when we get there, the power supply will be free. Should also pay note that there are little washers between the power supply screws and the power supply, so remember to put them somewhere safe for when you reassemble the machine. Removing the top cover, well, it's not a shock to discover that it's kind of dusty in there. Who knows when this machine was last used, but the fact that it's actually still intact and doesn't look like it's been messed around with too much, is a good sign, honestly. To remove the power supply, we're going to have to disconnect all the cabling. Now, don't worry, everything is marked on the board, so it's easier than it looks, but it's not the kind of power cabling you expect from old machines. This feels very sort of, well, a little shoddily put together in the best way possible. I honestly mean that. It's just not what you'd expect, spade terminals just connecting to random points on the board. Nonetheless, they come away easily, they're easy to put back in, and yeah, next job is getting that power supply out of the case. With the power supply out and the cover gone, you can see the cause of our magic smoke, that 0.1 microfarad X capacitor, the reefer, the horror, the annoyance. Unsurprisingly, before we can actually test our power supply with the new capacitors, I have to change the plug. It has an old UK plug on it, and this one's a little weird. It's actually got built-in surge protection, which I've not seen on the British plug. Either way, here's our European one, and it's just a matter of wiring it back up, nice and simple, so they can plug it into the plugs here in Vienna. With the capacitors replacing the power supply, let's reconnect up the board and see what's what. Let's actually see our BBC spring to life. I actually don't imagine there's going to be much wrong with this machine. These things are pretty bulletproof. Or at least, so I thought. So yeah, here we are. I've put it on our actual CRT machine and I'm running it through the video out using a BNC connector that I didn't throw out 30 years ago. Fantastic. So let's see. It beeps and we're into a prompt. However, I note this. There's no text on screen. So I'm going to hit break. And I know to get into basic, I have to do shift star and just type basic. Nothing. However, now I do get text. Now, I don't really know the BBC well enough to know if that's normal. See, I've now hit break again, so it's gone away. So shift, basic, enter, and then we can do the usual 10, print, yeah, I haven't written basic in a while, print, I, 20, go to 10, look at that now, I've spelled that wrong. Run. It won't run because obviously I can't spell today. Mistake at line 20, so you know, 20. I wonder if that'll actually work. 10. Run. There you go. So that actually works. Now, I suspect it's because we don't actually have a lot of ROMs in here. You may have noticed that. So all we've got is basic. Break. And again, we're out. So let's see if we can improve matters and find out if there's anything else. But before that, I think this machine this case needs some cleaning. And hopefully I'm going to try and retrobrite it by just using some UV light. Come on. Oh dear. Well, never mind. Let's do a cleaning montage while we wait and work out what exactly our problem with the BBC is. Enjoy. And stop. So I'm about to go down a very bad road that's going to lead me around the houses, losing me about 2 hours of work. Now, I'm going to explain as we go along how I got there, some of which is just bad information, some of which is me misinterpreting information, and some of it is just me being an idiot. However, I'm including it in the video because it's not a bad thing to make a mistake. In doing so, I actually learned a bit more about how the machine works, and most importantly, despite going down the wrong road, I actually came back around to what the fault was once I'd realized my mistake. So it's good to include it to show that not all repairs you see online are going to be easy, quick, fun, and people do make mistakes, myself included, and I am always learning, and you should too. So come with me and we'll find out how I got it wrong and then got it right. Come on. Before that though, it's time for a word from our sponsor, PCBWay. We all know that PCBWay make fantastic PCB boards, starting from just $5, and include things like, well, getting a replacement board for this old ZX Spectrum. What happens if your 3D printer isn't up to the task? Or you're having a little trouble with your CNC machine? Then look no further than PCBWay. In fact, if you can design it, PCBWay can help make it a reality. PCBWay, way more than just PCBs. For more information, check out the link in the description below. So the trouble begins with the Troubleshooting the BBC Micro. Now, it's a book made way back when the machine was new, and I thought, rather ironically, it could help. Now, included in it was a good troubleshooting guide, and this is where it led me down the wrong path. You see, IC5 is the teletext ROM, and its symptoms fit perfectly. No message on boot up, check. White screen flashing cursor, check. Characters entered but do not appear on screen, check. Modes other than 7, changes background to normal and displays keyboard entries, check. Now, according to this, everything I'm looking at is going to be the teletext ROM. So that's what I did. I bought some spare teletext ROMs and changed them out. Let's see what happens. With the teletext ROM swapped over, it's time to power on, and well, what do you think is going to happen? We have the same problem. The machine is still showing a blank startup screen, and we have no hope of getting anything. It's only when you type in something you can get it back. So IC5 was not our problem. So it was time to hit up the schematics and head over to the forums and see if I could find a lead on what our issue was. If it wasn't IC5, the teletext ROM, what was it? Well, sure enough, I got a lead that said it could be the memory. Now, the BBC has 32 kilobyte of RAM, and this is separated into two separate banks of 16K each. This is because the original BBC Model A had just the 16K plus 8 blank sockets ready to take another 16K. For the BBC Model B, like ours, well, they just filled those sockets. They just plugged in 16K, sold it as a BBC Model B. Now, this is useful because we can identify our upper RAM from our lower RAM, but it doesn't really help us solve the problem. You see, I suspect, from what I've read, that the upper bank of memory may have a faulty chip in it. So the only way I can really test right now is to somehow switch off that upper bank. Fortunately, the BBC has a little jumper switch called S25 that does just that. This little 3-pin switch with the jumpers in the top 2 position, well, it enables the BBC to keep all its RAM running, use the whole 32-bit. But if I move the jumper from the top to the bottom, well, it disables that upper RAM, and I've been told, from what I've read, that this might result in us getting the picture back. So let's try that. Now, sure enough, this actually does work. If I switch it on, yeah, BBC 16K basic. We've got our prompt and the computer is back working. Well, kind of. Okay, so the BBC is on the bench. We have to try and work out which of these ICs is broken. Now, we know that the lower RAM is perfectly fine because I can put the switch as it is now, S25, into its lower setting, and yeah, it disables the upper RAM, and the BBC boots up fine. And this was where I would make my second mistake, because although switch 25, when it's placed in the lower position, does disconnect that upper RAM, if you remove that jumper, it also disconnects the lower RAM and just lets it run on the upper RAM. And I had already done this, and the machine booted up just like it would now, BBC 16K, but with the upper RAM working fine. So that meant there were 0 RAM faults on this machine. The fault was somewhere else, but I didn't realize this and spent the next 2 hours scoping out each individual address line, the data lines, the RAS, the CAS lines, all the interesting little bits on these chips, driving myself around in circles, looking for issues where there weren't any, and then finding, oh, this data line on this chip just looks slightly different. That's our cause, that's the smoking gun. And well, it wasn't. The chip was fine. Even replacing it with another brand new chip failed to solve the problem, which was what made me realize I needed to go back to square one. And as it turned out, the answer to my problems was actually back at switch 25. So let's pick it up there. So now we're back at switch 25. Let's look what we actually know. Now, the switch works, or the little jumper works in a very simple way. If the top pin and the middle pin are connected, we know that takes a signal from somewhere on the board and sends a signal through to a small IC called IC45. And that says select section A and section B, and that'll run the 32 kilobits. But we know that's not working properly, or there's an issue with that. That said, if we connect just the bottom pin and the middle pin, we know that select B line works fine because, well, the RAM works. And if we remove it, well, the select A line works fine. So let's assume that our ground pin and our middle pin are fine because either configuration works well. The problem is coming to our top pin. So let's trace that back and see what's what. Tracing the pin back, that takes us to IC28. Now this is another logic gate kind of chip, and well, that's fine. It's actually got a selection of pins, and there are 4 inputs and then 1 output. That's all that's used on the chip. So let's see each individual one, and sure enough, when I get to pin 3, well, the signal doesn't look like the others. Following pin 3 back, that takes me to IC39, a 74LS283 chip. Now, I can tell you that the 74LS283 chip is a 4-bit binary full adders with fast carry chip. I have less than zero idea exactly what that means, but I can look at the chip and see there are 4 outputs, S1, S2, S3 and S4, and it's S4 that's heading to our IC28 pin 3. Now I suspect actually the problem is this chip. So let's change it and see if our problem is fixed. Right, let's test it. We fixed our thing. Did it work? Yes! BBC Computer 32-bit basic. Excellent! Well, let's put the rest of this machine back together and do our little bit of upgrades as well. Awesome. There are just 2 upgrades I want to do to this machine, the first of which is getting some composite color over our composite signal. As it stands, the computer puts out black and white composite, but as you can see there is S39 there. We just have to install a jumper and yeah, we'll get color composite. Let's do that. Then one final thing to take care of is installing an SD card reader so we can actually use the machine as intended, only with new modern hardware. So I went to the Future Was 8-bit and I got this SD card reader. It comes with a ROM, which I'm about to install now. You install that in the 3rd bank for this machine, and then we need to go to the user port and install the reader. It's actually very simple, and once it's done, the machine will be ready for use. Well, there we have it. The BBC is back together and, well, it's running beautifully. We have updated our screen so that we now have color coming out of the composite signal, which is great. The machine has now the new SD to BBC interface plugged into the user port to give us a wealth and a plethora of software that the machine would have had originally. And all in all, I have to say this has been a really fun project to take part in. Have I learned to love the BBC considering its school origins? Well, Chucky Egg here has been on this computer a lot this week, and I have spent more time than I care to mention playing it. So yes, the BBC has redeemed itself somewhat in my eyes. It has been a fun experience, and there's so much more to explore on this SD card. For the future, of course, we have to take care of the cosmetics. The case is very yellowed, and this black surround is incredibly brittle. This was intact until I started cleaning, and then it just snaps and breaks away into tiny little pieces. Now, I have an idea of what I can do to fix this, but that's going to be a very future project because I have other things coming up in the next few months that equally is interesting. But I will swing around to that and see how we get on, probably in the summer. All that's left to do now is say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it despite the mistakes, in fact, because of the mistakes. Down below you'll find the usual social media stuff, and when it comes to old computers, just remember, reuse, rediscover, recycle, and you never know, you might find your very own BBC that you should never judge by its cover, because despite being an educational computer and certainly teaching me a lesson, it's actually a pretty damn cool machine. My name is Jess B. This has been my tech department. Cheers!